right now? Not even someone wants to raise their hand just so I can say how special they are? So I have this issue. I'll talk about it in the slide, but I have this issue with the name Windows Azure SQL Database Design because that's a really long name. Do you agree? And even the acronym WASD is even hard to say. So I may lapse, much like a key Microsoft executive at a recent conference did, and lapse back to its former name, which is SQL Azure, because I can say that, or Azure. I guess where I'm from, I'll say Azure, but it could be, I think the official pronunciation is Azure. So a little bit of logistics. Please make sure your cell phones and Game Boys are silenced. And that includes all your awesome Twitter notifications and everything as well. The other thing is that this is being live streamed on Pass TV, which means that, you know, the back of your head may get famous as well. For those of you who just came in, I'm going to remind you that we are taking questions. You can come up and stand at the mic to ask a question or make an observation at any time. I'm not one of those speakers that makes you hold your questions until the end. In fact, I really encourage you to ask the questions as we go. So that's really cool. And the mic is right there. We're also taking questions via Twitter at #PassTV, and Tammy will be following those. Oh, look, here's an awesome template slide where there's all these awesome things that you've seen in every single session. You have them memorized by now? Excellent. So, session evaluations. You get not one, not two, but 3 ways, and I'm going to say a 4th way to provide your feedback on this presentation. You can go to Past Summit evals. Everyone using Guidebook on your phone? Because, you know, it's awesome to have the internet with you when you walk around. Or you can scan the QR code at the someplace out there to do your evaluations. Now, here's the thing. If you use Guidebook to do your evaluations, all you get to do is a star rating, I believe. And while the numbers are really good and it adds a great gamification to the whole Past Summit speaker experience, what speakers really, really enjoy is actual feedback and comments. So, and the comments and the evaluation numbers you give, while they are for the organizers and the program committee at PASS, they really are for us speakers to understand how we can make these sessions much more valuable and provide a greater experience for all of our future speaking events. Some people really like the point system. I don't. Maybe it's the fact that even on Foursquare, I don't care about the point system. I care about the interesting check-ins. But a friend of mine talks about when he speaks, that when you come around to giving a grade or a rating for a system, is that depending on your time, how much you learn in a 1 or a 75-minute session, what's this, a one-hour session, right? So he thinks, and he's an educator, that if you learn 3 to 5 new things that you hadn't heard before, that meant your time was valuable. And if you learned more, or even more things from the audience questions, even better. That's why we actually come to conferences instead of just watching it or streaming it or downloading the slides. Do you agree? Excellent. Here's my speaker bio. I'm Karen Lopez. I have a company called Info Advisors, but mostly what I'm known for is I tweet a lot. My Twitter ID is DataChick. And I'm also active on Facebook, mostly in a professional level, a little bit of what I had for lunch and some awesome space event that I went to, and on LinkedIn. And I would love to follow you, friend you, or link to you on any of these social media things. But if you put in your request that we met here at the Past Summit, I can process that a lot faster. Because I'm always interested in the things that you're sharing about your things as well. So has everyone told you about the SQL Help hashtag, SQLHELP on Twitter? You don't have to join Twitter to watch this. You can go to just twitter.com and do a search on SQL Help. You can get a dozen MVPs all racing to answer your question the best way and first for free. Everyone see how great that is? Any questions you have about SQL Server, data stuff, data architecture, sometimes about some thinly related things like data modeling and everything. So some assumptions. I do have to, in the time frame we have, assume that you have a basic understanding of data model-driven database design and the processes and how that works. You don't have to be an expert at it, just a basic literacy of it, and that it's more than boxes and lines and more than the drawings. So I'm going to, before we do this, I'm going to ask, how many people here are primarily, and when I ask this question, I don't care what your title is. I'm thinking about what you do and what your mama raised you to be. How many people are primarily production DBAs or operational DBAs? Development DBAs? Data architects, data modelers? Excellent. Developers? And for some reason, I have to ask this question separately. I have no idea. BI people? Why don't BI people think that they're actually devs or DBAs or developers? I don't know either. What else? Any managers, project managers, business analysts, system admins, network people? Excellent. We got a few people there. Excellent. What's that? SharePoint. Your SharePoint. Oh, do I have to ask that question separately as well? Excellent. So I talked about how I might revert to this, the product as SQL Azure by its formal name. And it was not TLA, which is a 3-letter acronym, but 4-letter acronymed as WASD, which I also find hard to say. But why this topic? Like, this is kind of an introductory level. What do we need to know about designing for Windows Azure SQL Database? Every day when I go, or not every day, every time I go on a run, there's this dead end that I drive to. And there's this, whatever that dead end don't keep driving sign is, at the base of it, there's this nice toaster. Can you see that? And I always think, why is the toaster there? You know, you're running, you're low on oxygen, you're not sure what's going on. So the question is, why? So why this topic? Because you guys said that you weren't using, most of you weren't using SQL Azure as for big mission-critical projects right now. The reason I think this is important is that you're a dev, DBA, or architect, or data modeler, any of those things, that we need to learn about what's happening out there in the world that's going to come down the pipe. Now, when a new technology, a brand new technology gets introduced at your companies, does your company say, hey, we're thinking about this new technology. We're going to send you to a conference and a couple weeks training, and we're going to hire you a mentor. We're going to buy you a bunch of books and some, that's what they do, right? No. What they do is you're sitting around a conference table trying to decide which muffin you're going to have and complaining again about how awful the coffee is. And some bright young guy across the table or gal says, you know what? Instead of doing this in regular SQL Server, we should do this in SQL Azure, right? And then the management goes, oh, what's that? And he's like, it's the greatest thing. You know, it's all in the cloud, and it's big data, and it's... And the boss goes, yes, let's do that, right? And then they turn to you and say, how long will it take you, right? And then you say, what? So the what is the reason that I believe that those of us who are interested in design and new technologies is that we need to start learning how to do this. Now, the great thing, and what I'm going to show you about having the opportunity to learn Azure, is that Microsoft makes that really easy and really fast because you know it's in the cloud. And so you don't have to ask your boss to provision a new server and go find some evaluation license and deal with maybe a sales guy and your licensing guy saying, I think we have a license, but I'm not sure, so don't use it, just buy a book. You know, all of those things. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to give an overview of what SQL Server and Windows Azure and what they are. I'm going to talk about what are the differences that a data architect should know. So I'm going to use the term data architect really broadly here. I just mean people who might do some modeling, understand business requirements, and try to figure out the best way to implement it somewhere. Got that? So you can have a dev hat or a dev DBA or even an operational DBA role and still have to have that interest. I'm going to talk about modeling tool support and other tool supports, a little bit about migration and how to model these changes, and give you not 5 tips, but 10 tips, I hope, on how to do that and some resources. So here's Karen's very, very simple overview of WASD. So we have the typical user who can connect to the Windows Azure portal because Windows Azure SQL Database is part of the entire Windows Azure framework, and there's a portal for managing those. I'm going to show you a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about how you access these things with client tools and apps. Those go to connections. And because it's the cloud, even though there's much more complexity happening between you and the cloud, to you, it just looks like you have a database or a series of databases and a server. Because a lot of the management is going to be, a management task is going to be managed by someone else, just like if you outsourced your data center. Now, of course, there's a much more complicated, or much more detailed, I should say, view of how these things work. And basically, at the bottom level, we have this infrastructure layer, a platform layer that has the engine parts of SQL Server, and some Windows Azure stuff, and all the management services for them. And then above that layer, provisioning, billing, and metering, and all the connection routing, and all the network stuff. And then these data streams, and then how you connect, and then all your application and tools are on top of that, which include native SQL Server tools and other third-party tools. And that's actually what happened. And that happens to repeat 3 times, and this is just a conceptual diagram of the Azure framework. What's important here to know is while you need to understand how all those things work in the undercovers, you don't need to know a whole lot about those, because someone else is managing those. And throughout this presentation, I want to give a little caveat. I'm going to talk about a lot of things that aren't supported under SQL Azure. But it's not my point to be critical of it, but as an architect, I believe we need to know the things that aren't supported so that we know we don't have to model those, we don't have to design those, we don't have to do those. Where things are the same, I mean, I could list all the objects in SQL Server that are the same, but it's a lot easier to talk about the parts that aren't supported and kind of give you a fundamental background about why they aren't. So, what's different about designing and modeling for Azure? So, the first thing is, you're familiar with the editions of SQL Server. Of course, they depend on what version you're using. So what are some of the versions? There's like editions, there's Enterprise, there's Standard, there's Express, there's Embedded in the old days, right? Right now, there are only 2 editions. I'm going to put a little star on that for WASD. There's a web edition and a business edition. And the difference between these editions right now, absolutely 0 functional differences. The only differences right now, today, and you're going to hear me say a lot, right now, today, because one of the scary things about presenting on Azure is things change. And those of us who are presenting have to go read what has changed just every time we present to make sure our slides are up to date. And this is going to be one of my key findings about working with Windows Azure. So right now, the differences are the max number of databases you can have are the same for the 2 editions. Right now, you can have 150, but one of those is master. So really, you can have 149 user databases. And then for the web edition, you get to choose either 1 or 5 gigabytes. And for the business edition, you choose between 10 and 150 in increments between there. And I'm going to show you that as I create a database live in front of you. Now, I say today that the only differences between those are how they're sized. And when you create them, you choose a max size. But I'm guessing, I have no inside knowledge of this, that there's a reason we have 2 editions here. I'm guessing at some point, as more features are added, there may be functional differences. And so you'll need to pay attention to those things as well. So the cost model for it. So everyone just assumes that you put something in the cloud, it's just cheaper. And by the way, I have a few Azure subscriptions, and my cost model is very, very low. I mean, I see these bills of, you know, sometimes depending on what I'm doing, 50 cents a month and everything, but that's because I'm just doing it for demos. What I like about that cost model is that in the old days, before I had access to this, I'd just create virtual machines, put them on my laptop, I'd go run something and play with it, and then I'd run out of hard drive space because I'd find I had built 50 virtual machines, all with more and more instances of the OS and of the SQL Server engine and everything. Now I can fire up these virtual servers and databases up in the cloud, and it costs very little. And one of the things I'm going to encourage you to do at the end in my call to action is that you go make sure that you've signed up for an Azure account, a Microsoft Azure account, and go start firing up some stuff to play with it. With the key caveat is that you remember to turn them off or delete them, because the way things are costed in Azure is that you don't pay CALs, you don't pay license fees, you don't pay a per core fee, you just pay a base rate for something existing. I call it like the hotel model. It's where your server and your data is going to sleep at night. You pay for that flat rate, and then you also pay for the bandwidth. And right now, you don't pay for moving data into the cloud, but you pay to get it out. So You can go and put data up in there for free and play with it and do all that other stuff and delete it. And if you're querying it back out, then that's when you're going to pay as you bring data out of the cloud. You don't pay if you're moving data within the same regional center to move data across, like from an app server to your database server. That's all free. Just pay to get the data back out. So, a really short demo. So what I say is provisioning a WASD database takes less time than it is to get a QTSL. Who knows what a QTSL is? Oh, come on. No one follows me on Twitter? No. Quad tall soy latte. That's my Starbucks drink. So, did it switch? Good. So I'm going to call this Kitty. Never type in demos, right? And you can see under web version, I get the choice of either 1 or 5 gigs. Oh, and by the way, I will not be offended if you have to tell me to zoom it, because it's hard for me to see these screens at the same time. You get to choose your collations for the database. And this is the billing part of the model. So this is one of my subscriptions, Kali Dev. And then you can choose a server. And I can go create a new database server, which means I've got to do some more stuff here. So the database server settings, I have to choose a login name. Okay, who's going to write down my password so I remember it? Nobody? What's that? And then you get to choose your region, right? So this will impact performance. And you can decide that choose your closest one or your most exotic one. The other thing is that you may also have legal and privacy implications depending on where you're throwing that data. So let's see. So it's off creating this database. So notice I didn't choose, other than the web edition, and the business edition, I forgot to do the drop down, would have allowed me to choose between 10 gigabytes and 150 with some increments. And it is created. So notice I didn't say SQL Server 2012 or SQL Server 2008 R2, and it doesn't say SQL Server 2014 CTP. From your point of view, there's one version of WASD. There's no more versions right now. The closest thing we have to versions in Azure is that they have releases that are annotated like November 2012. So the November 2012 release of SQL Azure will be the current one. So there's no, so you'll have to go to the mic, sorry. So there's no versions there. And in a way, that can be frustrating for people, as well as a bonus because you're not having to worry about compatibility. You might have to turn it on. It's on the tab on the bottom. No, sorry, the bottom of the mic. There you go.
So when you initially size your database, how careful do you have to be? So if your database grows, can you resize it at that time?
Yeah, so the question is, when you initially size your database with that max database size, can you change it? And you can. You can do an alter database statement to change it. But once you hit that max, it's not like a max on application throttling or anything. It's not a throttling. It's just like having your hard drives full. So it would be something that you can't add any more data to, right, once you hit that max. So you'd need to monitor your database size. So one of my tips that I talk about at the end is that we as architects are going to have to do a lot better job of data profiling and capacity planning volumetrics of trying to figure out how much data is going to be in this database, as well as how fast is it going to grow, and in what is the nature of the growth. So my data modeling tools that I use have a nice feature in there where I can go for each table and say, it's going to have about this many rows when we deploy, and it's probably going to grow 10% per month or 10,000 rows per day or something like that. And then it does the math for you, which I think is a brilliant way to use a computer. It does the math for you and will calculate how big that table will be and how big all of its indexes are going to be. And based on, and you can, if you have a variable length field, you can tell it for that variable length field, on average, how long is it going to be. and it will do volumetrics planning, capacity planning for you. Most of the enterprise class data modeling tools will assist you and do this. The unfortunate thing is a lot of data architects never take advantage of that because right now we've gone through these phases where, you know, we used to worry about how wide a column was and how big a table was. We worry about it now for performance reasons, but now we're going to have to worry about it for configuring things in the cloud as well as being able to tell someone how much it's going to cost. And I think one of the changes that will happen as this cost model changes is that we architects will have to go back to really doing a lot of consideration and a lot of modeling, and I mean not logical data model, physical data modeling, but modeling of the cost to figure out what is the cost of deciding, well, you know, let's just make the notes field max varchar, or let's make every field allowed to have 2,000 characters. Now we're going to go back to worrying about how wide fields are, because if you have quadrillion rows across your database, and you've been very verbose in your data, and you never archive your data, you can measure the exact cost of that. And in fact, I think there'll be a new profession out there for data professionals of helping people figure out how to curb their cloud database costs. And they'll come in with tools to do the things that you should have done at the beginning to say, hey, you know that developer wanted that duplicate data everywhere? This is what it costs us every day. So great question. So we provisioned that database, and it also meant that it provisioned a server. Now, one of the things you need to know is, see these beautiful server names? Can you see it? Doesn't matter, they don't mean anything. You don't get to choose the server name. It generates this string character thing. And what else do I need to show about it? So I was cheap. I just made a 1 gigabyte web edition database, which will cost me pennies because it has no data in it. And I can do things like import data into it, export data. I can go and manage it. Oh, and one of the things it's going to prompt me is that, of course, this is all out on the web, so there are certain things it needs to do. So I'm going to say, yes, allow this IP address, which probably just allowed it for all 5,000 people who are connected to the Wi-Fi, who would have the login, at least. And yes, I want to manage it now. Yeah. Oops. This is what I tell you, don't type it in demos. And there are some basic tools that are available. I'm guessing most people are not going to manage their production databases through a website, but this is a portal, gives you some information. I'm going to manage my databases just like I do everywhere else, which to me, because I'm a data architect, and I know for those of you who are DBAs and devs, you can cover your eyes. You're going to have to look at a data modeling tool. So what I have here is, it doesn't matter what this model is, and this modeling tool is one of the few that I know that supports Windows SQL Azure database directly. So I have in the model at the top of the screen, is an eMovies model, which comes with the tool. And you can see that it is a SQL Server 2012 physical data model. And that means, that it supports a whole bunch of traditional SQL Server ways, encryption keys, database roles, full text catalogs, what else? Sequences, which are new to 2012, audit specifications, and then all the tables and normal stuff. But what I did is I also created, it's the same logical model, created as a physical model, but now the target database is SQL Azure. And there's no versioning there, there's no version of it and everything. And the reason I wanted to show you these two things is if I bring up the editor for this table, you can see that it has some general characteristics, these tabs. It has row GUID, sparse column support, constraints. It allows you to set and model things like, let's see what else. A lot of these physical things. But if I flip over to this model, one of the things you'll notice is that my list of things I can manage and model just got really small. Because this modeling tool knows the difference between SQL Server 2012 support, object support, and Azure, it's not going to let me model all that other stuff. So there's nothing about encryption keys, there's no sequences here, and we'll talk about all these differences. The reason I think that it pays to have an enterprise class data modeling database design tool is that now you're using a computer for what it's smart for, and that is knowing what's supported in your target database. And okay, here comes the exciting part. If we were going to go through and forward engineer this Azure database, and there's one thing I want to make sure is turned off. Yeah, it is that I have all these settings. I'm not going to go through those because it's not a data modeling tool thing. If I generate those in my database, sorry, I forgot to change the connection. One of the things that you'll notice is that the way you connect to an Azure database is exactly the same way. I have to give a login, and I have to tell it its server name, which means I have to flip back over here. Where am I going to cut this from? Sorry. That is the same spot. And go grab, I guess I could have grabbed it from right there. That's how I'm going to log into my server. Which I will go back, sorry. Okay, I'll bail on that. I would just put that meaningless server name right in here as part of my connection string. And part of the Azure portal will also show you all the connection strings depending on whether you're using .NET or ODBC, and it's a different form of all those things. And if I connect to that database, it would be just the same as any other database where it was on premises or on this laptop, and it would allow me to just connect that way. If your tool doesn't support some of these things, doesn't support Azure natively, you may have to connect in less than optimal ways, or you may not be allowed to at all. So if we'll go back to our slides. The other thing I wanted to point out was that right now in Azure, you can only connect to port 1433. So you may have security features or corporate standards that your databases, you don't connect through the standard port. You have to do that with Azure. You notice there wasn't a choice to do that. So the first thing that's different is data types. Now, I included a list, the part in gray, things that weren't supported in Azure databases. So in the past, geospatial data types, the big imagey blobby things weren't supported, some text types, some user-defined types weren't supported. All those are supported now. So the data types that aren't supported now is a very loose list, is these very large user-defined data types, as well as some that are supported by SQL database, but not supported by the sync tool. And the data sync tool is how some projects are going to bring their data from on-premises into the cloud on a regular basis. So one of them that's not supported under sync is timestamp, which is already deprecated anyway, going to be deprecated in a future version of SQL Server. But you'd need to know not just the differences of what's supported in SQL in WASD, but also what's supported in the tools you're going to use. And also, this is kind of an odd question to answer, but some data types that were deprecated, back in SQL Server 2000, yeah, they're not going to be supported in the cloud. So some physical stuff. There's no partitioning. There's no federation of databases. There is federation. That's how you're going to do the partitioning, but you don't set up a partitioning range. Like in your modeling tool, it's not going to show you how to do that. But you can do what I call faux partitioning and sharding through database federations. And one of the reasons why this is important is, if you also think about it, remember that 1 gigabyte limitation, which is the largest a database can be? You guys all have databases that are larger than 150 gigabytes. So now, as an architect, we're also going to have to think about how data might be physically separated across multiple databases. There's no you can't set a compression. You can't set page level compression or row level compression. You can't decide how it's compressed. You can't decide that some data is compressed or not. You don't manage that, Microsoft does. There's no TDE, there's no transparent data encryption. How many people have requirements for data encryption for sensitive data? How many people actually follow that? Oh, don't raise your hand. And no support for file stream data, and no support for anything that deals with where the files go, what the file group is, what spindle it's on, none of that stuff. But the reason this is, you have to go to the mic, please. I think it's on already.
You turned it off.
Yeah, you're on already.
Is it on?
Yeah.
We are required to do FERPA and HIPAA compliant, and last year I'd heard from one speaker that she didn't think it was very good, but now our management is saying it's been improved. Can you speak to that?
So instead of answering that question directly, because I'm not a HIPAA expert, on the Azure portal, on the windowsazure.com, it gives you their certification statements, which is all the great legalese. So it doesn't really matter what I think or you think or your boss thinks. I always point people to the official statements as they exist, because that's what your lawyers are going to want you to know about, right? Is that fair? You want to rephrase your question, right?
Until the data is compromised, and
Yeah.
then we're...
Okay, so now you're asking more of a functional question as opposed to just HIPAA and everything. Is it safe? So of course, every architect needs to do that assessment, whether it's data sitting in your own data center, a third-party data center, a server sitting under the DBA's desk. You guys don't do that anymore, right? No one does that anymore. Yeah, they still do. So that type of security assessment has to be done no matter where your data is. I will say, of the projects I'm aware of that exist in the cloud, not just in Windows environment, are some of the most security intense things, right? And so we're not just talking about sensitive data here, because again, there are all those certifications that have to happen, but that some of the leading users of cloud services are organizations like the CIA, and of course, Microsoft uses it quite a bit for Skype and for Xbox and all of those accounts and everything. I have this, I'm sort of, it's a mixed bag answer for me, because I've worked in enough medium-sized shops to see a lot of data security practices that I feel are less than optimal, like servers running under the DBA's desk, and I've watched servers walk out the door on the police tapes, which, by the way, got broadcast on the nightly news. That's going to happen as well. So, no one wants to give you a guarantee. I'm putting data in the cloud right now that I feel is safer than the servers that are sitting in my own home. But then again, I'm not putting other people's data. I'm putting test data or my own data. So I think that assessment is something you make with your architects, your business users, and your legal team, and maybe your PR team as well. So here's something else. Great news is clustered indexes are not required on your tables, unless, of course, you want to put data in them. So Windows Azure SQL Database is perfectly happy with you creating tables with no clustered indexes, but when you go to insert data, it fails. So you might as well make part of your design strategy is identifying what your clustered index is going to be on every table. I think data in tables is actually a good thing. So I tell people your DDL will run just fine, your DML is going to have a problem, right? So not supported. There's only limited support for systables. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, because systables has a whole bunch of stuff in it that you would normally use to manage the very physical nature of your database, and yet you're not going to get to manage those things. But some systables are available. No extended events and no policy-based management. So if you're using policy-based management, it's not there today. You can't specify any replication or mirroring. It's all managed for you, and this is how it works in a nutshell. When I created that database, I actually created 3 copies, or I didn't, Microsoft did, the portal did, the computers did. They were smart. They created a primary and 2 secondaries, and when one of the secondaries fails, the other, just like in your own replication, your own high availability strategy, it all works. And then the other thing that happens is that your transactions are only noted as being complete when they have been recorded on the primary and the first secondary. Right, so that seems to be a typical high availability approach as well. So this is things that we don't have to manage now, is provisioning 3 servers, because those 3 virtual servers were completed in that short time frame. Tammy, I should ask you, do we have any questions yet? Excellent. So if you have questions for me, either in the audience or out there watching on PASS TV, use the hashtag PASSTV, and we'll get those answered. So some other things that aren't supported that makes me as a data architect really cry are things like anything that's in extended properties. So I can't put definitions and notes, and all data architects love writing beautiful definitions and notes, right? You guys all love writing them, right? Yeah. And then we love when people actually read them and follow the great advice that we put in them, right? A customer is only a person or an organization and not a dog. Well, maybe they are. So none of those have a spot in SQL Azure right now. So they stay beautiful in our data models, very well documented on reports, on the portals that we make of our data models, but they're not going up onto the tables and columns. UDPs and attachments, so these are data modeling terms. These are basically extended fields that data architects use in our data models to do things like track who's the data steward for this table, is it PII, is it sensitive data, what else? We might use when was the last time this entity in our data model was analyzed, or who is the DBA responsible for this particular table or set of tables. None of that has a place to go in the cloud in SQL Server. So all kinds of good stuff that data architects love, right now today have no place to go. Also, reusable defaults. Reusable defaults, you can still have a default for a column, but reusable defaults are those things that you reuse in many places. Like I usually create one for a flag, yes, no, or something. I can't create one of those right now. You had a question, yeah?
Yes.
Come closer to the mic.
Okay, you say there's no place for it, but there's always a table you can create that
Yes.
has that stuff in
Thank
there.
you. A very good comment. That we could always go create a table that then our devs will query to go find out the definite. So like extended properties manually, right? Thank you. Do people actually use those? I find end users do, by the way. End users are the ones who want to know, what is this column? What does it mean? Yeah. So some more things that aren't supported. Change data capture. It's a new feature in recent versions of SQL Server. Master data services, I already talked about extended events and file stream. SQL agent. You guys all need to use SQL agent, right? There's no SQL agent. So what are you going to do? Well, one of the reasons why there's no SQL agent, not one of the reasons, but usually the way people use it is for backups, right? But there's no regular SQL Server backup in the cloud either. So the way you do backup in the cloud is you can export the data, you can do a DAC and a backpack to export the data. You can now, this just came out a few months ago, you can now automate these exports and put them maybe on another Windows Azure server so that they're all in the cloud, because remember, going cloud to cloud doesn't cost you anything. If you bring your backups down, you'll be paying for that bandwidth. So those are the ways you can do backups and restores. But there's any other jobs that you would normally run with an agent, you won't have that availability. And sequences. Yeah, go ahead, ask a question.
It's more a comment. I think you can run SQL Server Agent from your desktop and point it to Azure.
Yes, because
Right.
you just connect to it anyway, but there's no backup command.
No, that I understand, but
Yeah.
sometimes people need to automate things that are not backup related.
Yes, yeah. So whatever's supported, if it's supported over there, yes, you could, because your native tools are just going to see this as a regular database, as just any other database. So modeling tool support. I mentioned that I'm only aware of one enterprise class data modeling tool, you know, something that does logical and physical data modeling that's been around for a while. I think that may change in the future. And why that's important to me as a data architect, though, is that if my modeling tool doesn't support these unique features, so I want to reiterate that SQL Server in the box, meaning on-premises SQL Server, and SQL Azure are a lot the same. But they are different enough that I can't just point a tool at it, and I can fib to it and say it's a SQL Server 2012 database, and it may or may not work, and it may or may not do things right, and I will probably fail a lot because it will try to do things, or I might try to do things like create a partition or maintain a partition, but there's no partitions in Azure. So I think it's going to be important to us as data modelers and architects to ensure that the vendors of those tools are going to support Azure, because otherwise we're going to do a lot of stuff by hand. And then there may be specialized tool. Like the tools, I can go delete tables, create tables, modify tables, all in that management portal on my database. But we know web-based database design is probably going to be a bit difficult. I think that's there for doing something quick and dirty, or doing something when your tool isn't going to support it. And then your native tools. So SQL Server Management Studio, yep, you can connect to it. Do I have one of those open? No. So I can connect to it and do whatever I want. And the native tools just support it. What I'm most worried about as a modeler and an accidental DBA or a sometimes DBA is I have all these scripts and third-party tools that I've collected and sold and got my boss to buy for me. And now I have to tell her, yeah, I might need to switch tools, or I might, and when that guy at the table says, we're going to use SQL Azure for this, and all my mind's going, are my tools going to support it? Is our testing tools going to support it? Are all the things that we do to connect to databases? You know, and we get to tell the end users, yes, you can point Excel to it. Yeah, we're happy. Yes, you can connect to it, but can you do the things that you want to do with those tools? So the next thing up is how do I migrate a SQL Server design to WASD? So the first three are what, if you go to windowsazure.com, it will tell you what your options are. You can generate a schema from Visual Studio of your 2012 or 2008 database, and then hand modify it to take out all those things that aren't supported, like create sequence, like row compression, or encryption, or partitioning, and then run that against Azure. And then I'll tell you, and then now repeat that cycle about 22 times as you get that all done. You can use the Microsoft Sync framework to do that. And Microsoft also provides some tools that you can point at your on-premises SQL Server databases, and it will tell you what things you need to change to move it over into Azure. You can use the DAC packs and backpacks to do that, but you'll also have to make sure that you can support those features. But I'm biased. As a data architect, I'm going to use data model-driven design, which is a whole other presentation I have, which means that I'm going to do exactly this. I'm going to have my SQL Server database or logical model, and then I'm going to go to derive. Let's see, do I do that? Where do I do that? I can't remember here. I'm going to go create a new SQL Server 2012 database based on those tables, or a new SQL Azure database from that logical model or from my 2012 physical model. And then I'm going to do, it's going to be the same thing as if I'm converting a model from Oracle to SQL Server. It's going to be the same sort of thing. I'm going to have to look at all the compatibilities. I'm going to have to understand how my modeling tool transforms a database from one platform to another and make sure I agree with those. I'm going to have to worry about things that didn't come over, like sequences and all my partitioning stuff. And not only with the database, but I'm going to have to work closely with the devs and the operational DBAs so that we can say, you know, I do my database design. It's not just the data that I have to worry about. I have to worry about how the application is going to access the data, where it's going to expect data to be, what data types it expects, what the screen UI people are expecting. Like, it's just like any other migration. And a lot of times in demos, like you've all seen those, where someone has demoed a design tool and they just open up a DB2 database, and then they go up here and they just change it from SQL Server 2012 to, let's just pick Teradata for kicks, and go like that, and it goes boop, 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 and now it's done. Now, would you throw that into production? You have no idea what it did, right? And then they might come back here and like, oh, you didn't like that? Well, let's just change it back. Where is it? No, I can't even find SQL Server. Anyone want to guess how many things changed in that database that I just flipped it over to Teradata and back to 2012? So you see a lot of migration demonstrations that go that fast. And I'm here to tell you, in the real world, anyone done a major migration from one platform to another? Yeah. Did you live through it? Mostly? Yeah. Yeah. Did it take longer than that? A little bit more, yeah. So the good thing is you are going from SQL Server to SQL Server, so it's going to be a lot easier. Yeah, you have a question?
Entity Framework's out, developers. I have one in
I've
my
heard that.
office who would love to just create a database from .NET code.
Yeah.
Our database administrator left recently. Does it work with Azure?
I don't know that fact. I'm guessing it does, but I don't know that fact. So if anyone out in Twitter knows, or anyone in the audience knows. It does? Yeah. So I'm guessing it does. Yeah. Code first database design, right? That's what you're talking about, right? Yeah. That's tough as an architect to try to not be in the way of people who are doing great things. But as an architect, I want to use real architecture tools to do this migration. And that involves understanding the semantics and why we did things one way. We might have done it because of a limitation in 2008 that we might not have to. You all are dealing with designs, right, that were kind of wonky because of SQL Server 2000, and yet we've migrated that wonkiness from one version to another. Yeah, that's why I want to do this. So modeling for SQL Server and WASI. So I'm going to have customer table, and it's going to exist in two places, right? It could. It's going to be on-premise for all of our applications that still do it, but maybe I've migrated one application up to the cloud. Now, how am I going to model for both of those? Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to model it just like I do for the 30 other places where the customer table is in more than one place. You guys do that, right? Wait, you have no duplication of data? Oh, lucky. No. Don't believe that for a minute. So I'm going to do it the same way. I'm going to have one model for each physical database I create, and I'm going to maintain those either through manually keeping them in sync or using the compare tools. I'm going to do it just like everything else. The fact that this is SQL Server in the cloud doesn't matter. The biggest difference for me as an architect for these things is that in the past, if you were supporting a SQL Server 2008 data model and database, when did you have to worry about migrating all of that to 2012? I'm not asking for a time frame, but what caused you to start worrying about that? Somebody said, I think we should upgrade, or someone bought an application, or the application vendor said, we no longer support Windows 2000, you're going to have to upgrade, right? The difference about doing that in the cloud is when Microsoft decides to upgrade the versions over a couple years, you don't get to opt out of that upgrade, right? But that's a feature. It's not a problem. It's a feature. You guys are laughing. It is a feature. Is that how many of you are supporting older versions of SQL Server and you'd love to be able to have it migrated so you can take advantage of new stuff, but no one's going to fund that, right? Because it's really hard to convince management that we need to spend money just so you guys can have new tools. That's how they think about it. So it is kind of a feature that you'll get new stuff without ever having to convince management that you need the new stuff. And yeah, so the question I usually get at this point is, well, maybe you're going to ask it.
Yeah, that's a great thing, but we have applications that run on these databases, and sometimes your applications don't keep up with what Microsoft is putting out the new version.
Right.
You can't have them update your database when it's not going to match what your application is going to need.
Perfect.
Was that what
Thank
you-
you. That
what
was
you
really
wanted?
close to the question. Thank you. So basically, if things are changing up there, what if you're not ready for the change? So what does that mean? Well, that's true for a lot of things, just like patches sometimes break backwards compatibility. So my guess is they're going to have a long deprecation lifetime. You know, right now they announce things and it's usually 2 years, 2 versions, major versions later before it actually goes away, something like that. Is I think they will support old things. I think a lot of the features that we'll see introduced in Azure will be new stuff. Like right now, I think reporting services and all that BI stuff isn't supported, is that they'll add stuff. So that generally doesn't break backwards compatibility. But it means for me as an architect, I didn't used to worry about staying up to speed about what was coming down the pipe. I waited until someone said, hey, we're thinking about migrating. How tough is that going to be? Now I have to be much more proactive. It means I actually have to read those announcements. I have to visit the website to find out what's happening. I have to go to events. I have to, like, it's a much more proactive thing. And I think that's a fair trade-off, but it will also impact what solutions I will vote are good candidates for the cloud, right? If you have a really old application and you know the whole management feature of it has been, we will not change it ever, then maybe that's not a good candidate for a cloud. That's more of a political, cultural difference than it is a technical thing. That's my biggest difference for the cloud. So it's both a good thing and a bad thing, that I don't have to convince people that we need to upgrade for new features, because new features will just be there. And I also now have to be more proactive in dealing with things. So 10 tips for designing. Size doesn't matter. It just costs more. Next one is, size does matter. We're going to have to pay attention to those additions and how they've been configured. And I'm going to be doing a lot more capacity planning in my tools to help the people who are provisioning these databases, monitoring them, and maintaining them to understand not only how much data we're going to have on day one, but how it's going to grow and what sort of time frame is it going to grow. Like if we know that we're adding a gig a month, then you have a 150 gig database that starts at 50 gigs. You can kind of project when that database is going to be too big, right? You'll need to do this data profiling more often. If your data modeling tool or your database support tools or your design tools don't support it directly, you'll have more work to do because you'll have to hand modify anything that you've created unless your tools support these. And Azure is like New Jersey bridges. You don't pay to get in, you pay to get out. You pay to get your data out. You're going to need to track size of your tables, your rows, your database, and the costs of them much differently. How many people know how much it costs to store a terabyte of data on your current on-premises databases? You do? Why do you know? You have to pay for it? You have to bill for it. Oh, okay. I hope when you move to the cloud, you guys get the same answers for how big they are. So that's a good thing. But projecting the cost, I mean, the way I work on a traditional project, usually I just sit with the server admins and we kind of guess what kind of, not guess, that's kind of an insult to them. We figure out how big of a server we need, what else we're going to put on it. We decide how big the hard drives and how many cores it should be and everything, and we just go. And if we know we're running out of hard drive space, then we start planning for upgrading the hard drive or the SANs or whatever. If backups are taking too long, we look at how to do that. Now I have to do more of that more up front to help the provisioning and the monitoring people stay up to speed, which also means we'll need to track those Microsoft announcements for the changes. This is the most important takeaway that you can take from this, is you need to start telling your tool vendors that you want your tools to support Azure. Because until they hear that from people, you can't just sit back and think that they will eventually get around to it. The way vendors prioritize what they're going to spend on is what the requests they receive. You can't put off these deprecated items or new features. You can't opt out of a change. It's just like you can't opt out of, like SkyDrive. You can't opt out of a lot of the features. It's in the cloud. Someone else is managing it for you. They get to decide. You should enjoy the new car smell of Azure, because it's always going to be new. That's the other great thing. So the silver lining is someone else is managing a whole bunch of stuff that you don't have to manage. And the dark side's really just a trade-off. Like, there are a lot of people out there blogging about how awful it is in the cloud and how you don't get to decide what spindles you have and all of that stuff. It's not an either-or. A good architect knows that you're just finding the right solution for the problem you're trying to solve. And I'm working on another presentation right now to help everyone understand what's the right problem that Azure might solve. Do we have a question, Tammy?
We do.
Yeah.
So we have two comments from earlier that we did answer about the extended properties and using another table.
Yeah.
I just wanted to acknowledge that I wasn't ignoring them. The question here is, do you think it's worth computing the cost of on-premise data storage admin to compare to the Azure cloud?
Yes, it's very fair. In fact, that's what a good architect does, because every good architecture decision is based on cost, benefit, and risk. And anyone who wants to argue that we need to do something one way, that can't talk about cost, benefit, and risk, and the cost doesn't have to be dollar cost or currency cost. It can be just the opportunity cost of doing something, the cost of having to have someone to maintain these servers, right? Because you're paying for people to maintain the servers through your subscription, not via paying something else. And I think that's why a lot of people are trying to build up the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt with the cloud. I mean, I don't think it's a solution for everything, but it's not an either-or question. It's a finding the right place to use it, or deciding that it's not right now, is that it's going to be changing. But if people are saying, don't use the cloud because this, they need to say because of this cost or this risk or the benefit's not there. And then you know they've thought through the process. It's not just someone who's worried that their job is going to go away. So some resources. There's training available on the portal. There are some tutorials. I could just get lost on some of the stuff that's out there on MSDN. So besides the normal articles and everything, there are tutorials on database federations, the entity framework. There are more tutorials out on just regular through community and downloads. There's a whole set of videos. You'll get very familiar with using MSDN because that's where you're going to find out what's new and what's changed, and where you're going to figure out what things are different. So a lot of their articles do talk about what things are supported, let's see, and migrating. Firewall differences, everything. And they have written a lot of these articles in a way that say, this SQL Server thing is supported here, these things aren't supported yet, and all of that. Does that. I'm starting to blog about it. Other people are starting to blog about Azure. I know Tom LaRocque does. I know Grant Fritchie does. I know a lot of people do. They're giving presentations. There are videos you can find. Right now, Scott Klein's book on SQL Database for Windows Azure is probably the most common one out there, but he would tell you right away, it's already out of date because things have changed. So my guess is that your best bet is more online sources. I did find this book very useful, but online sources are going to be the way to always learn about cloud technologies. So my call to action for you is go sign up for a free trial of Azure. There are a bazillion free trials out there. So you can go get like $250 credit for firing up a subscription, firing up that database, playing with it, and all the other Azure stuff that are available out there. Go watch some tutorials, read some blogs, physically go create a database, and then call your mother and tell her you created a database in the cloud. And then tweet it as well. Don't forget to tweet it. Go add some data out there and play with it. Keep playing, deleting the data, stopping it, and repeating. Like this is my number one use for it right now is, right now, did you know that you could go fire up a SQL Server 2014 virtual machine out there? So it'll have the on-premises version of SQL Server 2014. The one that was just announced yesterday is already available that you could be hands-on with it. You don't have to download an ISO. You can just go provision one, boom, and start playing with the new features there. So in the slide deck, I'm not going to read these to you. These are the first places I think you ought to go. There's white papers, there's what's new, all the links for finding out more. And the slides are up on the PASS website, so don't bother writing those down. I'll remind you again that feedback's important. If whatever feedback and evaluation system you use for this doesn't allow you to provide detailed feedback, I'd love to hear from you personally, or you can tweet it to me or DM me or hook up with me and send it to me via email. Oh, Tammy, do you have a question?
I've been advised that Guidebook does allow for comments.
Oh, does it? Is that through the evaluations picture? Because there's one way you go to the session and you just click on the stars.
My advisement was the questions, the comments are.
Excellent. So there's some place in Guidebook. Yeah, so you have to go to the evaluations icon and let you do that. I do not mind critical comments as long as they're constructive, and I do want feedback on what would make this more valuable for you as a 1-hour session. So thank you very much. Thank you for your great questions. Thank you, everyone out.